the Sri Lankan Cricket Board forgot they had a women's cricket team for what seems like a couple of years. A few players found their way through to franchise cricket, and the rest stayed at home and didn't play much cricket at all during COVID. They just were on the shelf. In a World Cup division that included a rapidly improving Bangladesh, New Zealand, and England, Sri Lanka was perhaps the best team for South Africa to start against. A big enough name for casuals to think that's a cricket team, but also a side struggling enough that the home team should win fairly easily. The home team did not. South Africa had countless chances to put away the Sri Lankans in that first game, and instead we had an upset to start the World Cup. The ICC was left shaking their head at the second straight tournament where the home team has lost the opener. Never ideal. And South African women's cricket was left in disarray. And of course, that's more or less where it had started this tournament as well. In fact, it might be their default position. They entered the World Cup with a stand-in captain because their leader was unable to pass a fitness test. There is no need to relitigate Dane van Niekerk's broken ankle, weight loss, and very slow time trial. But it is worth mentioning that as someone who has covered this team for nearly a decade, she is a pure cricketing talent. She's slow as hell in the field, but she reads the game a lot quicker than other players. And in terms of runs and wickets and strategy, well, she's just well ahead of everyone else. And probably the exact kind of player you'd want in the middle order of a chase on the opening night of a home World Cup. And she isn't even the only player they didn't have that you would probably want. If you had one of those middling pesky totals, the best way to kill it is to bite the head off it at the beginning. What you want is a power play savant. And the best in the women's game at that is Lizelle Lee. She had retired the year before for also not passing South Africa's fitness concern. Wherever you stand on Cricket South Africa's new hardline approach, it would be impossible to look at this shock loss and not think these two would have helped a lot. So after one game of the World Cup, the South African team looked beat. When I started covering women's cricket, my main question was always, where are the South Africans? England and Australia were powerhouses, India had gun players coming through, New Zealand were good enough to snag a title, West Indies were clearly building something, but South Africa seemed to have almost nothing at all going for them. If you're old enough to remember, the South African men's team had this incredible fanfare after readmission, but Cricket South Africa had apparently forgotten to invite the women along at all. Despite winning about 50% of their ODI games from 2000 to 2010, they were just not really part of the women's cricket conversation at that point. Their single success was actually in the 2000 World Cup. They made the semi-finals that year. The next tournament, they hosted it and they came 7th. Even their pesky recent nemesis, the Sri Lankans, had had some success in big World Cup games. The West Indies had won the 2016 edition. And South Africa just remained a non-entity in the women's game. And it's not just the 2010s and earlier where they were struggling. In T20 cricket, they've actually been really disappointing as a side. Actually, considering the tournaments have come while they've had a good team, you would argue their golden generation, they've actually been worse of modern time. They have a 40% win percentage in the T20 World Cups. That's really terrible. And they made it to 2 semi-finals only. And all the while their players have been travelling around and playing in franchise. In fact, if it weren't for franchise cricket, I would wonder where South African women's cricket would even be right now. Most of the other teams' success has been because of their own domestic tournaments or big help from their local boards. The early rise of the South African women really does seem to come from the fact that so many of them were picked to play in the Big Bash. Then eventually they would go to the 100 as well, and a few of them in the CPL. This gave them an incredible core of players. And Van Niekerk and Lee we have already discussed. And there's also Mignon who retired not that long ago. But of the current crop, you have Shabnam Ismail, the world's fastest bowler, either by the speed gun or if you just ask her. She's undersized, but with enough confidence to make her a giant. And that pace is real, and she has bothered a lot of batters in this tournament. And it isn't just her. The women's game is actually dominated by spin, as I made in the video the other day. But South Africa is all about seam. And I suppose South Africa has always been about seam. Ayabonga Kaka was the one who really changed that semi-final against England. And it is worth mentioning that game. South Africa made all their runs at the top, but several times in the chase it felt like England just had that game in their pocket. Then Kaka had a triple strike, and in a couple of minutes she took South Africa from behind to level and then in front. But if you were talking about the face of South African women's cricket, and more specifically seam bowling, it would be hard to go beyond Marizanne Kapp. She's one of the most talented and smartest seamers in the world game. She always bowls like she's seen every single situation come up before. And it was her in the semi-final coming in at number 3 and smashing it around that really put pressure on England. So think about this, she can swing the ball up top, is hard to budge when she's bowling at the death, can bat anywhere from number 3 to number 7. They do not make many cricketers like this. And it would have been a shocking tribute to her if the team never made a single final with her in that side. Think of having someone with this talent for over a decade and just making your first final. And then of course we know how much it actually meant to her. It might have taken a long time for South Africa to get behind their women's team, but they certainly did. Sadly for them, making the final and selling out the final are huge moments, but you still have to play the Australian team. The Aussies entered this final with a 28-2-1 record in their last 3 years. And in this game, I would actually argue they weren't even that good. Half of South Africa's early score was from misfields. Their bowlers kept hitting the wrong lengths, their batting never hit hyperdrive, and there were so many gifts of extras that just usually don't happen. But I want to point out the absolute absurdity of playing against Australia. Forget that the #1 wicket taker in T20 didn't even make the squad, or the #2 wasn't even in their best 11. In the 10th over, as they had already squeezed the poor life out of Tasman Brits, the South Africans needed around 10 and over at that point. So Australia bring on Georgie Wareham. Like, she's an afterthought. She averages less than 14 runs per wicket in T20 internationals. And then for the 11th over, it was Talia McGrath. Again, like another afterthought. She's got a sub-18 bowling average. When you play the Australian women's team, it's like playing the men's USA basketball team in 1992. Oh, I can't remember them, but I had a dream about them once. It doesn't matter who their best player is, or their second best player, or their 7th best player. They're still probably better than anyone you have. It's an incredible lineup, and it just doesn't quit. And to beat a team like that, you need something incredibly special. And Laura Wolfart is incredibly special. Wolf is a dream to watch. Her batting is like on rail, and when she started hitting sixes, it actually felt like South Africa could beat Australia, even though they were already a fair way behind in the game. But South Africa had never won against Australia, or scored more than 141 against them, nor had they been quicker than 7.1 runs per over in a DRS-reduced semi-final game. And even the Wolf, in full flight, if wolves do in fact fly, couldn't take them down. There's no doubt that there is a letdown when you lose a game like this, even against cricket's most inevitable force. The South Africans were dreaming of this victory, but instead, Australia picked up their 13th World Cup, which feels like a typo. But let's just focus on what South Africa did. They picked themselves up from one of their lowest ever moments, without their inspirational leader or their biggest hitter. They smashed New Zealand, beat England in a semi-final, and they at least made Australia make more errors than we usually see from them in an entire tournament. It is just another win for the Australians. But for South Africa, it might be a loss, but it was something else. Their greatest moment in women's cricket.